Slave breeding farms were a grim and disturbing aspect of American history, representing one of the darkest chapters of slavery. As the world began to condemn the inhumanity of the slave trade, the United States, heavily dependent on slave labor for its economy, sought alternative methods to maintain its slave population. The ban on importing slaves from Africa led to the establishment of internal slave markets and the breeding of slaves within the country. At the turn of 1820, the United States had approximately 1.5 million slaves, a population crucial to the economic prosperity of the nation. Plantation owners, who relied on slave labor for lucrative crops such as tobacco, cotton, rice, and sugar, saw breeding slaves as a means to sustain their workforce. Over the course of 4 decades, the enslaved population in America grew to around 4 million, largely facilitated by the breeding farms located in Maryland and Richmond, Virginia, among other areas. These farms supplied slave stock to the Deep South. The legal ramifications that led to the breeding of slaves within the United States stemmed from the abolitionist movement in Britain, led by figures like William Wilberforce. The Slave Trade Act of 1807 effectively ended the Atlantic slave trade, prompting the United States to address the international outcry against slave trading. On January 1, 1808, the United States prohibited the importation of slaves, vowing to protect its own production. Thus, the gruesome practice of natural increase began. Life on a plantation for enslaved people was a dehumanizing experience, characterized by backbreaking labor, deprivation, and violence. Slaves typically worked in the fields from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week. Food was often scarce, with sustenance reaching levels barely fit for animals. Those on smaller, struggling farms might not even receive enough to eat. Living conditions were abysmal, with meager shacks comprising little more than dirt floors, lacking basic furniture. Violence was omnipresent, frequently perpetrated by overseers, the haunting figures responsible for overseeing slave labor. Overseers were employed on larger plantations to maximize the productivity of enslaved laborers. Their compensation depended on extracting the maximum possible work from the slaves. In pursuit of this goal, overseers employed nearly any means deemed necessary, leading to notorious accounts of cruelty and violence. However, the reality was complex. Overseers faced impossible demands, as plantation owners sought both maximum efficiency and a compliant workforce. While some overseers were vicious and prone to outbursts of violence, others were aspiring managers or plantation owners' sons looking to gain experience. Nevertheless, the turnover rate for overseers was high, as excessively cruel individuals risked damaging the property value of the enslaved laborers. Another layer of brutality in the slave-master dynamic was the appointment of drivers. These individuals, also slaves, were entrusted with the responsibility of overseeing their fellow enslaved people. While masters enticed drivers with promises of better privileges for ensuring increased productivity, the position created animosity among the enslaved community. Drivers' tasks were arduous and virtually impossible, requiring them to balance the master's expectations and the trust of their fellow slaves. Nonetheless, drivers were often more enduring figures than overseers, preferred by plantation owners due to their perceived competence. Although hated by their peers, drivers offered some slight mitigation of the cruelty imposed upon their fellow enslaved individuals. Slave narratives provide chilling accounts of the brutality endured by those forced into mating. Assault, rape, and forced relations were rampant, often perpetrated by slave masters, their sons, and overseers. Arranged marriages and forced breeding practices became prevalent as plantation owners sought to increase their stock of slaves. Slaves were treated as mere livestock, subjected to selection processes mirroring those used for animals. Men were chosen as bucks, while women were reduced to breeders. These women had their bodily autonomy stripped away, forced into sexual relations to produce more slaves. They endured multiple pregnancies from a young age, giving birth in poverty and being expected to conceive again within a few months. The lives of breeding women were marred by physical and psychological torment, their bodies and children treated as commodities. The history of slave breeding farms is a harrowing testament to the depths of cruelty and exploitation endured by enslaved people in America. It is a chapter of history that fills us with shame, and reminds us of the resilience and strength displayed by those who suffered. Subscribe to our channel to explore more episodes of History on Fleek, where we delve into compelling stories from the past. Together, let's continue to shed light on hidden narratives and strive for a more just and compassionate world.